If psychology and pop culture had a baby, they'd call it Shrink Tank.
There is a sort of pendulum that's swinging back and forth where we kind of go from one extreme.
And I think there's an element of truth to
because
this.
I have something interesting later in the show that will make you feel very weird.
From Nashville and Charlotte, this is the Shrink Tank Podcast. Hey, welcome back, everybody. Thanks for joining us. I'm Dave Verhagen in Nashville. We have a great show for you. Our trending topic today is the Callout Culture. We'll get to that in our second segment, but first we're going to meet our Charlotte panel. Dr. Emma Kate Wright is here. Emma Kate, how are you?
I am doing fine, thank you.
Have you ever been called out in your life?
For not paying attention? Absolutely.
Every week on the podcast?
Right,
Yes.
yeah. Squirrel. No, in terms of like doing something wrong, I can't think of anything off the top of my head that would really, most of the times I've been called out in my life, it's because I'm either talking when I'm not supposed to be talking or not paying attention.
Interesting. I bet you Frank Gaskell has been. Dr. Frank Gaskell's with us. Frank, have you ever been called out?
Oh, yeah. I was on a panel with an author who wrote about the culture of men and parenting and technology. And the room was filled with a lot of moms, and I was the only dude. And she was talking about how women can't get ahead, that they're not progressing, that things are getting worse for women. And I mentioned one of Phil Zimbardo's theories about how we're losing our men and losing our boys due to pornography and stressed out parents and single moms. And when I finished, in front of the audience, she said, yeah, none of that's true, and he doesn't know what he's talking about. And anyway, and I'm like, what did you just do? It was brutal. Just
Did she
brutal.
really say it that way?
Yep. Because I had said things like, look how women are getting elected to political positions. Women are starting to lead other organizations. There's a long way to go. But on the flip side of that, we're also losing our men. And she would have none of it. I just sat there mortified.
She called you out.
Man,
Yep.
I wish I'd been there.
Speaking of someone who calls Frank out, Jonathan Hedderly's here. He's our certified Asian. He rounds out the panel. Jonathan, have you ever been called out?
Not on a public level, I don't think. But I mean, I've been accused of having a vulgar sense of humor.
Accused.
What?
Yes, I've been accused. There's never been evidence presented to me.
I've given you evidence when we were having hot dogs one day.
Frank always accuses me. This is public. He introduces me to complete strangers and says he's racist. So that I get called out on. My family at various times have called me out for either being a know-it-all, or I think my wife, Julie, once when we were arguing, basically with some more colorful language than I will present here, basically stop talking like a therapist when we're arguing as a couple. So,
Oh, yeah, I used to get
boy.
that.
I was very aware of that.
Well, speaking of talking like a therapist, each week Jonathan trolls around the internet and finds a great story of therapists and psychology and similar things in the news for our first segment that we call
Being Human.
Now, I don't know if this has anything to do with the study I'm about to share with you all, but I remember when I was growing up and I played Tetris, late at night when I would close my eyes, I would still see the blocks in Tetris moving down and around
Yes.
when my eyes were closed.
So true.
Now, according to a new study in the Journal of Consulting and Clinical Psychology, playing the popular video game Tetris may help people with PTSD to alleviate reoccurring visual memories of their traumatic experiences. And so the researchers assume that the success of this method is based on the following mechanism. When a patient visualizes the stressful memory, it is hypothesized that areas of the, I'm going to try to pronounce this correctly, visuospatial processing in the brain are activated, and that comparable areas are also important for playing Tetris. So both tasks that require comparable and limited resources, resulting in interference. Emma Kate, as our resident person that shared all about her own traumatic experiences in her own personal life, what do you make of Tetris helping PTSD patients?
Okay, so first, this is really exciting research in terms of trying to figure out different ways to help people that have gone through trauma. And so, you kind of explain it, but again, when someone's exposed to a cue that's related to their trauma, it activates the neural systems where it's storing those memories. And so, but the key when you're treating trauma is it's about creating low stress, because, if we reactivate that memory and you're highly stressed, then that memory can be strengthened. And so, playing this relaxing visual game after you're seeing these flashbacks, these visual flashbacks, it makes sense for people who have that. And so I'm really interested to see where this research goes, just in terms of different potential ways to target these issues.
When I read the article, I tried to remember how it is to play Tetris.
How is to play?
And we
Callout.
we just had a training on EMDR, which is a treatment for trauma. And I'm wondering, I was kind of surprised to see they didn't reference that, because that's still eye movement, repetitive eye movement. And I'm wondering if there's a relationship between what their experiment is and Tetris as well as EMDR.
And to clarify, EMDR is eye movement.
Desensitization response.
So, yes.
Reprocessing.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, and it involves having your eyes go back and forth bilaterally from side to side as you think about a traumatic event. That's what first thing I thought of when I saw that we were going to be talking about this. Is it feels like it's a similar thing. It feels like it's something that you're doing to do something where with eye movement, maybe not even bilateral, although maybe that helps your brain process it. So I know that EMDR works because I've used it and I've seen the research on it. And so it makes sense that something involving some level of movement helps with trauma. We know that trauma gets encoded back in the back part of your brain, your occipital lobe, where movement is controlled. So that also makes sense. There's something about movement and processing of trauma that we don't fully understand yet. That's
when you're playing the game, your eyes do exactly that. You are scanning left to right to left to find a spot where that next brick will fit.
Yeah. I like stuff like that because even though I think this is an early study, there things that involve movement and your brain and the ability to process trauma feel like they open up a whole world of possibilities for treatment. So it's cool stuff. Well, if you have questions or comments about that, including the processing of trauma, but also the playing of Tetris, we'd love to hear from you at feedback@shrinktank.com. Let's move on to our trending topic. We're going to talk about the call-out culture. We've been talking about this a while, and really what we're talking about here is how everybody seems to call out everybody else. All these celebrities are calling out each other. People on Twitter are calling out celebrities and athletes and political figures. So, like currently, just as a few examples, the men who are responsible for the movie Green Book are getting called out for a story that's kind of another white savior story and written by a white guy, and the black man's family is not supportive of the story, so they're calling him out. Kevin Hart got called out because of past homophobic statements in his stand-up routine. Then Ellen DeGeneres got called out for supporting Kevin Hart after he apologized. And Maroon 5's been called out for playing in the Super Bowl when there's all this protests going on for Black Lives Matter and Kaepernick and so on. Lady Gaga has been called out for having recorded something with R. Kelly in the past and not apologizing for it now. Athletes call each other. I could go on and on and on and on and on.
Oh, yeah.
So general thoughts about where we are with call-out culture. And obviously, we don't have to state the obvious, which is it's due largely to the rise of social media, where people that previously didn't have the ability to have their voice broadcast are now having their voice broadcast far and wide. But beyond that, any other thoughts about this as a good or bad thing, the good and bad of it? Could be both or either. imitate?
I guess, I don't know. My whole philosophy on life, though, is that more good gets done with love versus hate. And so, and I mean that genuinely, because when you think about, something, we might feel moved, whether that's a good feeling or a bad feeling. And those emotions typically drive us to action. And so a lot of times we're carrying our past experiences, our feelings, our beliefs with us. And so then, it's rare for people to actually stop and think, okay, so I'm feeling this way and it makes me uncomfortable, but what's at the root of that? Why am I uncomfortable? And so a lot of people just feel compelled to call someone out. And typically it's, for a good reason, but it's also because they can relate to it in some way, or, they may have something related to that. And we're wired to be angry because that's a protective factor, aggression. But I guess it's just more or less, I don't know, I guess there's just so much about people's lives being ruined because of this sort of culture that we've created. And it's not to say that people have done terrible things, but I guess there's also, it feels like there's a lack of room for individuals' growth, and that bothers me.
Yeah, I don't think we live in a forgiving culture, and it's super judgy. And I don't think a lot of this stuff would happen with the internet. Without the internet, there's nothing we can do about that. But my hope is this is a phase and not sort of a permanent stamp on our culture. And I think because of social media, Instagram, all these stories, it's like you did something 10 years ago. And I'm not talking about rape or anything like that. I'm just talking about like a homophobic joke. You did that 10, 15 years ago. And now we are putting current cultural standards on a decade that didn't have those standards. And that part of it I find really, really frustrating.
Well, first of all, I think everybody has sort of shared the same perspective of this is not going to go away with the internet or social media because you've given everybody a platform to communicate. I tend to think of it more about when I have arguments or conflict with my wife or my daughters. Oftentimes it starts out kind of petty or misguided. There's a lot of arguing or criticism that when I've started a fight with either of my daughters or my wife, that's misdirected. It's irrational. It's distorted. But a good resolution usually leads to a more thoughtful and thorough conversation on really what is bothering me or what is going on. So I tend to think of call-out culture in that way. And what I would caution us is to not be prisoners of the moment, to where there is a good chance in about a month or a month after the Oscars, the whole Kevin Hart thing will kind of fade. But right now it's not. So at the end of the day, I think Kevin Hart is going to be just fine. But will this lead to a larger, more thoughtful conversation about the LGBTQ community, and how they feel historically the jokes and humor at their expense, to where comedians can feel like, well, it's just being a joke. Why are you being so sensitive about it? To where they could just as easily say, why are you being so insensitive about it? And I think both can have a valid argument. So I think it's a necessary evil, but I tend to view it as more good change is going to come about this, even if it does create an overly critical or petty society, which I would argue we've always been a petty society. So I don't think the internet has changed that so much as it now has a record online that follows you.
But I think I agree with you. I think you brought up some good points, especially this piece of whether or not, okay, so calling out someone is fine, but I guess it's more or less the intent behind it. Is it meant to be constructive? Because, all right, so we're calling somebody out to try to foster change. But then when people say they've changed or they've grown, it doesn't feel like that's accepted. And so then, how do we move on? And so fine, you could maybe take the route of forgiveness, but that's more of this, personal thing where you try to let go and create a way to feel safe. But then it's, how do we reconcile the differences that maybe we've had? And I think that's the piece that I keep kind of being drawn to. And again, I think call-out culture is not going away. It's just, what are we using that for? And how is it going to, as Jonathan said, push us forward for better?
It does feel like it's coming from at least at its root, a good place, meaning the design of it as a larger thing is to call out things that are hurtful to other people, but it's really extended to a place where people are using it as opportunities for them to seize some form of personal power, because that's really a currency now. It's like, to be offended is to have power. Mm-hmm. And I'm not saying that there aren't truly legitimately offensive things. In fact, I think the stuff that Kevin Hart said was pretty hurtful. I think the things that he said in his monologue back in the day were pretty hurtful things to people who are in the LGBTQ community. But like Emma Kate's saying, then it becomes this thing of, you have to apologize in a certain way, then you have to become an ally, you have to do as we say, or we don't accept this. And for Kevin Hart, he's a pretty proud man. I mean, he's a guy who is very, like his sort of life philosophy is, you set goals and you move toward them, and so he just reached a point where he was like, I'm not going to be pushed around by this, rather than say, okay, I'm just going to keep, kind of tuck my tail between my legs and keep cowering and all this stuff, which ultimately creates this really bad thing happening, which is that the perception is that he's sort of this guy who's not friendly toward the gay community, where he's really said, I'm at a different place in my life. I think about it differently now. But because he hadn't said enough. And then when Ellen DeGeneres says, I believe him, I want him to host the Oscars, then the backlash against her. Who made her the gay pope? Who said that she speaks for all gay people? And then she gets it. Those things aren't, there reaches a point where some of the stuff is very counterproductive.
Well, and one thing I would say, and again, this is very anecdotal, so I don't have a research or something really substantial to back it up. But a lot of times, real substantial change, breaking the status quo, there tends to be a fall guy. And what I mean by that is, and I'm not excusing this, but if someone like Kevin Hart gets an over-the-top amount of criticism, or they focus on him, it's maybe not fair, but that usually happens. There tends to be collateral fallout when it comes to like real change, to where today's comedians, or even comedians of the past, now will think differently about either how they respond to their previous jokes, or how they share on social media without the context, which is what is lost with a tweet, things of that nature. I'm not necessarily advocating that or saying that that's good, but whenever I read history and you see like real change, there's people that fought for that change, and then there's people that really their lives were kind of ruined to bring about change. And again, I'm not endorsing that, but I also think we're in a very weird time, and we've talked about this, and my feelings about it continue to sway of where comedy falls in when it comes to humor and offense, because whether it be the LGBTQ community or whether it be somebody that's a victim of sexual assault or rape, it is one thing to joke about it. It's another when there seems to be these tropes that it's always at the expense, and then not only are they victimized, but then they're labeled as being overly sensitive and not having a sense of humor. And I kind of question that foundation in and of itself. Now, we just talked about call-out culture early on, that I've been accused of being insensitive or vulgar with my humor at times. And so I recognize even I can fall victim to that, but I think it warrants a conversation versus, well, it's always been that way. Why don't you lighten up? It's just a joke. If my entire life all I heard was jokes at the expense of Asians, I quite frankly would be pretty pissed off as well, and I probably would go on a vendetta to call out every celebrity that's making millions and millions of dollars at my expense, but then say, like, lighten up. I think I would be very, very upset.
So let me use a specific example here. This whole thing with Green Book, the film picks up a Golden Globe. Immediately after that, we hear, and it was happening before that, leading up to the Golden Globe. The family of the African American man that it features was disapproving of the story because they were not consulted or involved in the making of it. And then other people were saying this is another white savior trope, and which is arguable that it is or is not. And then stuff from a bazillion years ago from Peter Farrelly, the writer and the director, of him acting inappropriately. So it was all this sort of effort to discredit this film, in a sense, to kind of knock it down. It really ultimately will serve the purpose of keeping it out of contention for winning Oscars, I think. Do you think that is, I mean, is there anything, because this is ultimately, if you step back, you take 3 steps back and say, this is a film that really what it's about is a promotion of, it's an anti-racist film. It's a film that's promoting people being more accepting of folks from different races. It feels like a film that would be good for us to celebrate now. Do you think there's anything good that's coming from that kind of thing?
I have mixed feelings about that movie, which I have not seen. I think anything that can lead to a larger conversation is great. This is the one thing I have reservations about Green Book with what I know, is that it's based on a book by the son of the white protagonist. It is directed by a white director. They did not consult the family of the black protagonist, meaning it's a true story. These are real people. One of the primary persons about a story about racial reconciliation, they did not consult the person of color in this true life story. And in essence, the majority of people, because it's based on the book of the white protagonist's son, all the people profiting off this movie are white people. That to me, there's an element of problem. That to me is a little problematic, even if the movie itself is well-intentioned or a well-made film. That, if it was fiction, like The Help is a fictional movie. Driving Miss Daisy is a fictional movie. This is a real black man and his family, and they weren't even consulted about it, but the white family has representation and involvement in it. I'm not calling anyone out as racist, but I think that's problematic.
I would agree with that.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. But okay, so then if, just to play devil's advocate, we were to remove the aspect of them not consult, let's say it was a fictional story, would your perception of that be completely different?
I don't know if it'd be completely different, but the main thing that I have a problem with this one is the fact that it's a real person, and the black family is contended that they did not have a friendship as it's portrayed in the film. So you have this sort of like racial reconciliation that they feel like is very misrepresented and that it is more fictional than factual. But like The Help, I thought The Help was a very good movie. I've watched it with my daughters. I think for what it's trying to depict and the message it's sending, I think it's very digestible. It's well made. And other movies that quote unquote kind of historically get labeled white savior movies. I mean, I think there is a larger conversation of why those movies seem to not only get the funding, but they make a lot of money at the box office, where movies that are created by filmmakers or writers of color that have primarily a black cast don't make as much money. I mean, I think there's a larger conversation that can lead to, but I have no problem with something like The Help or other films that kind of get clustered into that. But I do think the fictional versus non-fictional real life person to me is a sticking point.
Any last thoughts on this call-out culture?
Well, I don't want to dismiss that we live in a very petty culture. I can be petty. I feel very fortunate that I had a life before social media, so I feel like some of the skills of restraint and not being overly consumed by social media has helped prevent me from making a lot of colossal mistakes or missteps with social media. But to me, not all call out is created equal, and hopefully the petty stuff will get its 15 seconds of fame, and celebrities, if it's not going away, get good counsel from their publicists on how to handle it and have it go away versus adding fuel to the fire. But I do think of certain things about like Me Too or March for Their Lives and other things that really Twitter and protest and disgust have really brought about a larger platform. And if that's the case, I'm all for those types of opportunities, even if they maybe are few and far between.
Yeah, and I think just my closing remark too is the call-out culture is here. I think it's just really important when people are deciding to make that choice to call someone out to consider what's the intent behind it. Is it to truly be progressive and to try to help somebody see a different perspective and interact with maybe a different whatever, then good. But if it's coming from a place to just truly try to tear somebody down, then that needs to stop.
Very good. Well, if you have questions or comments, we hope you'll write us at feedback@shrinktank.com. We'd love to hear from you. And our final segment, something that we call our doctor's orders. These are things that we're personally enjoying in pop culture. We're going to do it a little differently today. We're going to go around and before we give our doctor's orders, we're going to say what our New Year's resolution was and whether we're still in the game. If you've heard the previous podcast, since the start of the year, we were each given a New Year's resolution. We didn't choose them. They're given to us, and we are evaluating as we go for a 30-day challenge. So, Emma Kate, update on your resolution and then your doctor's order.
Okay, so I was told to not have coffee for 30 days, and I feel like I've officially detoxed from caffeine, and I'm not having headaches anymore, and so I'm going to make it. We're going to make it. And then my doctor's order is a really cool British musician and producer, Tom Misch. I hope I say his name right, but he has like a really fun blend of jazz, pop, hip-hop, and his debut album, which I just discovered through Spotify, but came out April 2018, Geography. Check it out.
So, yes, I have maintained my yoga challenge, and I'm ready for it to be over. But so that's probably not going to happen once I'm done. And my doctor's order is the Oculus Go, $199, and it's the best VR I've ever seen. It will blow your mind.
So my New Year's resolution or challenge was no eating out for 30 days. I'm holding to that. I used up my exception, so now I'm just trying to get to the finish line. I'm sure that will have some influence on me, but eating out is just one of my acceptable indulgences and vice, and at least currently I'm able to be active enough that it's not really killing my health. And for my doctor's orders, I went through a period where it felt like a dry spell when it came to things I wanted to recommend, but I've just accumulated a lot of stuff in a brief amount of time. I saw Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, which is a fantastic animated film and superhero film. You have to see it while it's still out in theaters. You have to see it on the big screen. The animation is remarkable. Netflix dropped a show called Sex Education. I binged it in about 3 days. Very funny. It's got a lot of heart. I loved it as a therapist, but also being a parent and seeing how a child of a therapist, the impact it can have on their lives, I thought was really, really insightful. And then if you have Amazon Prime, right now, 2 of my favorite movies of 2018 are now available for free on Amazon Prime. One is 8th Grade, Bo Burnham's coming-of-age story, and the other is a movie called Without a Trace, which is a really tender look at a father-daughter duo. He's suffering from PTSD and they live off the grid. Highly recommend that, Without a Trace and 8th Grade on Amazon Prime.
So I had hit a wall with my New Year's resolution, which was to walk 10,000 steps a day, which is, by the way, very unfair. I'll say that again. And
Zero bitterness.
And so I was encouraged during the last podcast to get back on that horse and ride, and I have. So I've started walking again. I had a dip of about 4 days, but I'm back in business. So it has not been a perfect streak, but I am walking again. So I will say that. I have 2 doctor's orders, 2 recommendations. One of them is the 3rd season of True Detective, and I think the reviews that you've read are probably true. It is way better than season 2 and maybe not quite as good as season 1, but closer to season 1. So I would recommend True Detective. The other is a Netflix show that is a British show called Bodyguard. It is a 6-episode series, and the guy who used to be in Game of Thrones, you remember him from the infamous Red Wedding, Rob Stark. He is the lead. He just won the Golden Globe for this particular show. It's called Bodyguard, and I definitely recommend it to you. It's a good show. And that's going to do it for this edition of the Shrink Tank podcast. We hope you'll check out shrinktank.com for great articles and videos. You'll also find links to our Doctor's Orders products. And you can follow us on Twitter at shrink_tank and like us on Facebook. For questions or comments, drop us a note. Our email is feedback@shrinktank.com. If you like the show, please give us a review on iTunes. It helps us build our audience, and we'd also greatly appreciate it. Our producer and theme music composer is Sean Beck, and our associate producer and social media guru is Mariel Butler. For Emma Kate Wright, Jonathan Heatherly, and Frank Gaskell in Charlotte, I'm Dave Verhagen in Nashville. Tell all your friends about us and make it a great week.
Shrink Tank.